Hello and welcome back to the Wallace branch, where today I'm continuing to fill in details of the downtown of Wallace, Idaho. And today, I'm going to start with a building that is now the Senior Center. Initially, I didn't plan to spend much time on it, and so my first result was actually a bit of a disaster. Accurate in the sense of capturing the front facade's appearance, but in terms of pixelation and my primitive model, they would have just detracted from any other beautiful details in Wallace, especially because the rear part of the building, the part that I'd spent the least time on, is directly facing the railroad tracks and therefore is highly visible. I'm learning a lot, and I hope to convey a few of those pointers while redoing my original failed effort. And also in going back, I didn't want to just fix those initial problems, but also create something that would justify the added time. I found these historical photos that show how the building looked originally, I think, and it had more of an Art Deco storefront with 3 shops and a very impressive marquee for the Wilma Theater. And that's interesting to me because there was a Wilma in my hometown as well, and from a similar era, I think. And I actually saw Annie there at the Missoula Wilma with my dad when I was a kid. So that Wilma sign in this photo immediately struck me. And it also explained an earlier mystery, which is why there's this gigantic eroded triangular concrete block that hangs above a side entrance to the Senior Center today. In this segment, I want to discuss 3 things that I learned in making and then remaking this building. First, this is the building where I really started to realize that eyeballing my models wasn't working. You've really got to measure things. And the ruler on Google Maps isn't very precise, but it's a lot better than what I could accomplish by my former method of just using the street front imagery and just scaling it on the basis of surface dimensions. The second lesson is that the rear ends are very important, not something you can assume people won't look at. Anyway, I ended up creating 3 cubes to represent the main body of the building, and then I religiously followed the shapes that I can see in the rear of the building from the satellite view and from this very obstructed view from the present-day highway. Not that the accuracy of those shapes really matters. I didn't end up doing anything with that triangle, but it sort of helps me know that this is an accurate model, and somehow subconsciously my awareness that I had just roughed in the building rear, that impinged on my suspension of disbelief whenever I looked at the building. The third lesson is more debatable, but I decided that I have to get away from using imagery of the real thing and go for my own found textures, like this yellow brick from a random photo, or a brown tile that I just made up to reflect the dark tiles that I see in this black and white image from the 1930s. And I decided to use that yellow brick in the rear as well, and that's what I consider debatable, because in reality, many prototypical buildings have radically different materials, both on their fronts and also their other faces. Not just because they passed through multiple different eras and went through renovations like the Senior Center obviously did, but also because they typically use cheaper materials in the back or maybe for certain annexes. Unfortunately, I found that using different materials in the rear, that might match reality, but it doesn't look very realistic to me because somehow we expect buildings to be a bit more uniform, and having one wall look radically different somehow also affects your ability to suspend disbelief. For shopfront windows and doors, I don't think I necessarily did such a great job here. I found some Art Deco window images from the UK because when I just searched for modernist or glass and aluminum windows, the results were totally unlike anything from the 1930s era. The present look of the Senior Center probably was built in the 1970s, and I think it already probably looked dated by the 1980s. But remember, we're going to look at Wallace in some earlier eras, even back to the 1800s. So I kind of don't want to clutter it up with too many obvious present-day looks. For the movie marquee, I had a lot of fun with this. The mast on this thing was just huge, towering way over the building and jutting out to be visible on the sidewalk from both sides. I found this typeface, Bauhaus, that I already had installed on my computer, and it turns out to match pretty well with the font in the black and white images, and also in the color image of the Wilma that's in Coeur d'Alene. Now, this building itself has sort of a Bauhaus style, actually, with its original brick and metal materials. I learned that this Bauhaus typeface was based on the universal typeface of Herbert Bayer, who had worked with Walter Gropius and developed Universal to match the Bauhaus principles, I kept noticing that the L on the sign was different from the L in Bauhaus typeface. But interestingly, when I looked at the original Universal typeface, it's actually pretty similar. It has these very blocky, straight T's and L's, very rectilinear characters. So I just used the Accidens Grotesque L, and I'm really happy that Photoshop let me swap out just one font for one letter. And I always would recommend making signage bigger in your image map to avoid or minimize any pixelation. I decided to also make two versions, right hand and left hand, because with this white or silver line or curve that goes around the sign, that makes it asymmetrical. And so having two versions in the image map will help me line up things without a lot of fuss. It's not necessary, of course, with other signs in town. I've used insets and mirroring, and sometimes the signs are so symmetrical that I can just mirror the whole face. But sometimes it's easier just to do it in Photoshop so that you don't have to fiddle around once you're in Blender. For the marquee, I also added a famous movie with an obvious connection to our storyline. This movie would definitely have been playing in Wallace when the interstate was under its early phases of construction in the late 1970s. And I looked up the movie poster for The Deer Hunter to make sure that I got the top billing correctly. And I also checked the runtime of the film, which was over 3 hours. So I put in the showtimes based on what would work for a single screen theater. That does not mean that I would want to start watching a depressing epic film like The Deer Hunter at 10 p.m. I also added these black boxes for a movie poster, and I also thought this Art Deco theater should have a nice door, even though this is probably an interior door, by the way. For the back, going to lesson 2 again, I wanted to make the building a unified whole, while not just copying the storefronts, since those are store windows, they wouldn't be in the back anyway. So I did find some typical window crown images and sash windows that are really common around brick buildings in the United States and in Wallace in particular. Final lesson, I realized after the first LOD that the rear doors that I'd put on were just way too big, and so I had to scale them down. And that's a really good thing to catch before the final LOD, and it's why it's best to test the model in-game multiple times instead of just using the preview window in Trainz. Final detail that I loved doing was the barber pole. Again, I used a big image for the candy-striped pole, and I also boosted the size of the fictional window lettering for the Cedar Street barbershop. For this balcony, I don't know what would have been there originally, but I decided it would look nice to have sort of an informal awning just by the door, and it looks like it could exist in any era. Maybe it's a little bit too simple, I don't know. And then after I finished that version, I went back and did a third version, this time with a procedural brick texture, and then also doing the weathered movie sign. This one isn't as weathered as the Samuel sign across the street from last episode, but still I didn't want it to be a perfect red and white color. Of course, it would have been better to have done it this way to begin with, but that's the way things go. the final result, in my opinion, does look much improved from my first attempt for the street. The rear of the building is still a bit basic and blocky. Just ignore those trees sticking through. Next, I wanted to tackle a pretty spectacular looking theater that was torn down long ago, the Grand Theater, which is 2 blocks away and down the same street as the Wilma. Basically, the Grand has this amazing sign. I only have a black and white photo here, nothing higher resolution, and after searching for some online photos of tragedy and comedy masks and related signage, once I got started, I realized it was actually going to be pretty fun. Then, since that was successful, I just used the same technique for the awning in front. Didn't need to be perfect. The most important thing is the color, which I thought might be a very oxidized copper color. After working on the walls for a while, I made several efforts at these little decorative roundels in the corner. The photo is too blurry to see what was actually in the roundel, but I thought it might be a lyre or harp shape surrounding something in the center. Of course, this would make a really cool Blender project to do in 3D and then maybe bake to a normal map, but again, I didn't think anybody was going to look very closely at this. For the front window, I didn't want to just leave them black or try to fill in any old movie ads or interior details, so I decided to use these glass blocks. And next, I tackled the sign again, which was a great pleasure. I think the final result was pretty good. It looks especially nice with the details on the horizontal pole or yard sticking out over the entryway. And then I did a little bit of effort into the squarish or blocky, but apparently Corinthian columns, Corinthian capitals around the second floor window, just enough to make them look minimally three-dimensional. The exterior of this building is really surprisingly quite ornate. And finally, I decided to give the theater a proper ticket booth out front, like the kind in the Westwood Theater that Sharon Tate goes into in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. It's the sort of fishbowl type ticket window that you'd probably hate to work in, but really does seem to represent an era in show business. And there we go. I hope you enjoyed this episode, the last of our series of 5 on buildings in downtown Wallace. In the next episode, we'll be finally putting down these buildings and finishing off the Wallace downtown. So if you'd like to be there, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on the Wallace branch.